Joining me now is Heidi Quattrocir, professor of law at Northwestern University, and Javed Ali, former senior director for counterterrorism at the National Security Council and associate professor at the University of Michigan's Ford Public School of Public Policy. Thank you both for being here. And before I get to you, Heidi Quattrocir, and congrats on that great piece, I just want to play Bill Barr agreeing with you, Trump's former and very sycophantic attorney general.
This entire thing came about because of reckless conduct of the president. If he had just turned over the documents, which I think every other person in the country would have done, they're the government's documents. They're official records. They're not his personal records. Battle plans for an attack on another country or Defense Department documents about our capabilities are in no universe Donald J. Trump's personal documents. If even half of it is true, then he's toast. I mean, it's a very detailed indictment, and it's very, very damning. And this idea of presenting Trump as a victim here, a victim of a witch hunt, is ridiculous.
So I think we can dispense with the idea that it's a witch hunt. But let's talk about the Espionage Act itself, Professor. Let's put it up on the screen. This is U.S.C. 793. Whoever having unauthorized possession of, access to, or control over any document related to the national defense, which information the possessor has reason to believe could be used in the injury of the United States or to the advantage of any foreign nation, willfully communicates, delivers, transmits, or attempts to communicate, deliver, transmit to any person not entitled to receive it, or willfully retains the same and fails to deliver it to the officer or employee of the United States entitled to receive it. Sounds pretty much like what Trump did. But you've been actually very critical of the way that that act was used under the Trump administration and even before. Please explain.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, it's a very confusingly written act, but it is important to note that the act actually differentiates between tangible items like documents and what the act calls information, which is, orally conveying information. When it comes to oral conveyances, you have this element that you quoted from where the statute says, the person also needed to have some reason to believe it could be used to harm the U.S., which is still a very, very light standard. But when we're talking about documents, it's an even broader act. When we're talking about documents, the only textual requirement is that the information be information, quote, relating to the national defense, and that it have been willfully either conveyed or willfully retained and not returned upon being asked back. Courts have added a couple of small requirements to that, one that it be closely held, which effectively ends up meaning classified, and one that it be information that might be, quote, potentially useful to an enemy or harmful to the United States. So my concern over the years has been that that language is so broad, and the classification system is, widely and across the partisan spectrum seen as so bloated that it essentially criminalizes the publication and certainly the publication of information that we see in the press all the time, and certainly the transmission of information to journalists to report them, including a lot of information we see in the New York Times and the Washington Post all the time. Now, it wasn't until recently that the act was used pretty regularly to go after media sources. It actually started in the Obama administration, but Donald Trump latched onto that use of the act with full force, outpacing all prior administrations in his single term, in going after media sources for conveying information to the press under the act, including, as you pointed out in that wonderful lead up, the famous case of Reality Winner, folks like Terry Albury, who was sentenced to more than 4 years, a former FBI agent, who also spoke to the press about his concerns about racial profiling and certain journalistic surveillance techniques. So I've always been very concerned about the potential free speech implications of the act. As it relates to Donald Trump, though, as the lead up wonderfully and very clearly articulated, I certainly see no evidence in the indictment or any of the public reporting that we had an effort by Trump here, to somehow serve the public interest by conveying important information. So this seems to be a far less flattering set of facts. than those that his administration prosecuted.
And the thing is, Javad Ali, the point, I think, of laying out those other cases, like Mr. Foe, for instance, who was working from home, essentially, still pulled 9 years. The gentleman who was sort of hoarding, which is identical to what Trump was doing, pulled 9 years. I'm sorry, Mr. Foe got 5.5 years. This gentleman who was basically hoarding like Donald Trump was got 9 years in prison. If Donald Trump is claiming he's being treated differently than anyone else would, this makes it clear he wasn't. If you could put that graphic back up, the only way that we've seen a disparity in the way people are treated when they take documents is that people who are way higher up the ladder, David Petraeus, war hero general, Sandy Berger, who was an NSA official, the higher up people are the ones who get probation and a fine, right? The ones who give it back, who are way high up, like the Vice President of the United States, former Vice President Mike Pence, who give it back, aren't charged at all. So if anything, Donald Trump is being treated far better than anyone else who has committed this crime.
Joy, great to be with you. And as Heidi said, and as your piece said, there's a long history of prosecutions under the Espionage Act for leakers, for people who unlawfully retained information and then didn't give it back when asked, and then the classic spies, the people who actually commit espionage. Now, the case with President Trump is under Section 9.3 is very different from the other two ones that I described. But the indictment sort of lays out a really strong case. And this is what I've said over the past year, that as DOJ was building the evidence in this case, whatever those charges were going to be and whatever that case looked like, it had to be very strong, because to bring a weak case to court wouldn't just be the right strategy. So as Attorney General Barr has said, and others, this seems to be a pretty damning indictment. And I think it's going to be a very tough legal challenge for President Trump to overcome, just based on the facts as we know them.
And Professor Petrosser, it's even worse in the sense there's a guy, and by the way, Daniel Ellsberg just died, who leaked the Pentagon Papers. We should note that he just died at age 92. That was sort of the famous case of somebody leaking to the media in the national interest, right? It's still considered a felony. But to go to somebody who's not on the heroic side, a guy named Jack Teixeira has been indicted and accused of doing, under the same statute, taking classified documents, bragging about them, putting them on a gaming server. He could be facing life. That guy with the Nazi tattoos and stuff. No one is going to look favorably on any excuse anyone else gives for doing this. Donald Trump is trying to claim that these documents are not just he could take them, but that he owns them. None of that makes any sense. And he is the one whose administration prosecuted this the most.
Yes, absolutely. And in terms of your point about and the lead ups, references to Trump's repeated claims that this is his information, he owns this information, they're in his beautiful boxes. It's simply not true. And the real cherry on top in terms of the absurdity of his claims that these belong to him is that he keeps citing the Presidential Records Act. I believe I saw one commentator, I think it was Daniel Dale of CNN, say, citing the Presidential Records Act as a way of Trump saying these records belong to me is akin to saying I was allowed to keep going when I was driving along the road because there was a stop sign. I mean, it's upside down world. It's the complete opposite of the truth. The whole point of the Presidential Records Act is that information, presidential documents, information one creates or possesses in furtherance of being president while they're president, are not the personal property of the president, right, and certainly of the ex-president.
And last word to you, I'll give you the last word on this, Javad Ali. Given this makeup of the court that we see in Georgia, would you expect, given these facts, for this to be a case that would be easy to prosecute and get a conviction?
I mean, that will be played out over the coming months. But again, the case seems really strong. The facts seem to be more in favor of the prosecution, and
sure,
President Trump's legal team is going to have to come up with a really novel approach to convince a jury that case isn't as strong as it is. And as someone who worked in the national security arena my whole career and dealt with very classified intelligence every day, I mean, again, it's inconceivable for this stuff to have escaped the official domain at the level that President Trump had. And at no point was any of that material ever officially declassified. There is a
Yeah.
process for that, but none of that happened
Yeah.
here. So again, I think the legal case is going to be very, very difficult for him.
Oh, but his defense is going to be, it's mine. Heidi Kitroser and Javed Ali, thank you both very much.